15 black actresses who were exploited on set. What if some of the most admired black female celebrities in America were not living a dream behind the spotlight, but surviving a nightmare? The red carpets looked glamorous. The cameras captured the smiles. But behind closed doors, some of these women were facing humiliation, betrayal, intimidation, and pain that the public never saw coming. Hollywood sold the fantasy while they carried the scars. Tonight, we're exposing the stories hidden beneath the fame stories, so disturbing they may change the way you see these stars forever. Stay with me until the very end, and subscribe now to Black Legends Revealed for the truth they never wanted you to hear. Tisha Campbell. Before the headlines, before the lawsuit, and before viewers noticed something had changed, Martin looked like one of the brightest success stories on black television. Tisha Campbell was a huge part of that magic. As Gina, she brought warmth with charm and balance to a sitcom that millions of Americans welcomed into their homes every week. On screen, she and Martin Lawrence helped create one of the most recognizable couples in 1990s television. But behind the laughter, the set was becoming something very different. In early 1997, Campbell filed a lawsuit accusing Lawrence of repeated and escalating sexual harassment, sexual battery, verbal abuse, and threats. According to contemporaneous reports, she described conditions that had become so intolerable that she feared for her safety. Lawrence denied the allegations, and the dispute was eventually settled out of court. What makes this story so compelling is not just the accusation itself, but the painful contrast between what the audience saw and what may have been happening behind the cameras. A sitcom is supposed to feel light, familiar, comforting. Yet one of its most important stars was no longer able to remain in that environment without legal action and distance. How unsettling is it when the place that made someone famous also becomes the place they can no longer safely stand? That question is what gives Tisha Campbell's story its lasting power. It was not tabloid noise. It was a rupture serious enough to alter the way a hit television show finished its final season. Reports at the time said Campbell later agreed to return only under restricted conditions, and the strains surrounding the production became part of the show's final chapter. Decades later, the public may remember the laughs first, but the deeper truth is harder to forget. One of television's brightest on-screen worlds was shadowed by a conflict so serious it changed the show itself. That is why Tisha Campbell's story remains one of the most haunting on-set controversies in black TV history. Lupita Nyong'o. Before Lupita Nyong'o became an Oscar-winning star and one of the most admired faces in modern cinema, she was a drama student still trying to find her place in an industry built on power access and intimidation. In her 2017 New York Times essay, later widely reported by major outlets, Nyong'o said she first met Harvey Weinstein in 2011 while she was still at Yale School of Drama. She wrote that people around her described him as a man worth knowing in Hollywood, but also someone to be careful around. That warning turned out to matter. According to her account, Weinstein invited her to his home in Westport, Connecticut, where she expected a professional meeting built around lunch and a film screening with his family nearby. Instead, after only a short time watching the movie, she said he led her to a bedroom and suggested giving her a massage. Lupita wrote that she felt unsafe, panicked, and tried to regain control by offering to massage him. Instead, only for the situation to escalate when he started removing his pants. She said she stopped the encounter and left. Weinstein later denied wrongdoing and said he remembered events differently. What makes Lupita's story so gripping is not only what allegedly happened, but how carefully it unfolded. There was no dark alley, no obvious warning sign, no dramatic scene that looked dangerous from the outside. There was a powerful producer, a young actress, a private room, and the kind of professional setting that can make a person doubt their own instincts until it is almost too late. How many young stars were taught to ignore fear because opportunity was standing in the room? That is what gives this story its emotional force. And the story did not end there. Nyong'o also described a later dinner where Weinstein suggested moving the meal to his private hotel room. and told her not to be naive, implying that if she wanted to succeed as an actress, she had to be willing to accept this kind of behavior. She refused. Years later, after hearing more women come forward, she said she realized what she had experienced was not an isolated misunderstanding, but part of a larger pattern. That is why her story hit so hard. It is not just the testimony of a famous woman. It is the memory of a young artist learning far too early how quickly ambition can be cornered by power. Thandiwe Newton. Before Thandiwe Newton became a respected screen presence, she was a young actress doing what countless performers do at the start of a career, walking into an audition and trusting that talent would be the thing being judged. But years later, Newton revealed that one early callback left a scar far deeper than rejection ever could. She said a male director placed a camera up her skirt and told her to touch her breasts while imagining the sexual circumstances of the scene. What makes the story so chilling is not only the violation itself, but the setting. This was not some shadowy back room disguised as opportunity. It was an audition, the very place where a career is supposed to begin. Newton also said there was a female casting director in the room, which only added to the confusion, making the moment feel disturbingly normalized when it should have been an obvious line no one should ever cross. Years later, she said she learned from a producer that the director had allegedly shown the tape to friends after poker games at his house, turning one degrading moment into something even more sinister. That is what gives Thandiwe Newton's story its lasting power. It was not simply a bad audition. It was a brutal lesson in how power can warp the earliest step of the filmmaking process, especially for a young woman who has not yet learned how much danger can hide behind authority. How many gifted actresses at the very beginning were made to feel that humiliation was just part of the price of entry? That question lingers over Newton's story because the pain was not only personal, it was structural. She later explained that she spoke out because even if just one woman read her words and avoided a similar experience, it would matter. That is what transforms her story from private shame into public warning. And that is why it remains one of the most haunting tragedies connected to the making of a film career, not because it destroyed her, but because it showed how early the damage can begin. Gabrielle Union. By the time Gabrielle Union joined America's Got Talent, she was not some unknown actress begging for a shot. She was already a recognizable star, a veteran of film and television, a woman with enough experience to know the difference between a tough set and a toxic one. That is precisely what makes her story so gripping. According to reporting and Union's own public comments, the trouble began almost immediately. She said she raised concerns about indoor cigarette smoke from Simon Cowell, which she said triggered her severe allergy, yet was made to feel as if her discomfort was the problem, not the behavior itself. She also said she received repeated notes about her appearance, including criticism that hairstyles she wore were considered too black for the show's audience. And one moment in particular seemed to crystallize the atmosphere for her, a joke by Jay Leno, comparing a contestant's pets to something on the menu at a Korean restaurant, which Union said left her stunned. She complained, and according to later reporting, she was told the footage could simply be edited out, as though removing the clip would erase what the moment revealed about the culture behind it. That is what gives Gabrielle Union's story its real emotional weight. This was not a young actress being quietly intimidated before anyone knew her name. This was a successful black woman walking into a major television institution and still finding herself in a space where speaking up appeared to carry a cost. What does it say about a workplace when the person asking for basic respect becomes the problem? That question sits at the center of her story. After one season, Union did not return. In 2020, she filed a harassment complaint, and later that year, she and NBC reached a settlement. But the lasting sting of her story is bigger than any legal resolution. It is the image of a woman with status, voice, and credibility still being forced to fight to be heard in a room that should never have made that fight necessary in the first place. Monique. When Monique won the Academy Award for Precious, it should have been the beginning of a bigger, brighter chapter. On paper, everything about her story looked like a triumph. She delivered a devastating performance, earned the highest honor in film, and proved she could command the screen with a force that was impossible to ignore. But what makes her story so gripping is that the victory did not feel like freedom. Years later, Monique said the trouble began because she refused to do additional campaign and promotional work for Precious beyond what she believed her contract required. She has said she was paid about $50,000 for the film when it was still a small independent project, and that when the movie became an award-season phenomenon, she was expected to keep promoting it without additional compensation. In 2015, she told The Hollywood Reporter that Lee Daniels had told her directly, "You've been blackballed," and connected that fallout to the fact that she didn't play the game. Daniels later publicly apologized to her in 2022, and by 2024 they had reunited professionally, a sign that the rupture between them had been serious and long-lasting. What gives this story its sting is that it does not sound like the fall of a failing actress. It sounds like the punishment of a successful one. What does it say about the industry when winning an Oscar still does not protect you from being pushed aside? That is the question at the heart of Monique's story. She later said she lost out on opportunities after Precious, including roles she believed should have come her way, while the label of being difficult followed her for years. Whether every name and motive in that saga can be agreed on or not, the public record is clear on one point: this was not a brief misunderstanding. It became one of Hollywood's most talked about examples of how a black woman could reach the top, refuse to bow, and then watch the industry make her pay for it. That is why Monique's story remains so haunting, because the pain did not come before the applause. It came after it. Halle Berry. Long before Halle Berry became an Oscar winner, a franchise icon and one of the most enduring stars in Hollywood, she was also learning a harder truth about the movie business. Success does not always protect you from disrespect behind the camera. That is what makes her backstage story so compelling. Years later, Berry looked back on her time in the X-Men franchise not just as a career milestone, but as a place where she had to fight to be heard. In a 2026 interview with Entertainment Weekly, she recalled confronting director Bryan Singer during the making of X2, describing it as one of the greatest days she had ever had on a set. According to Berry, the cast and crew were angry over Singer's behavior, and they pushed her to be the one to speak up because they knew she would. She said she told him exactly where to go, and Alan Cumming later described the same confrontation in his memoir. Singer's representative denied that the incident happened as described. What gives Halle's story its sting is that it was not just one tense confrontation. It was the larger pattern of power manipulation and disrespect that seemed to surround her even inside one of the biggest franchises in the world. In 2024, Berry reacted publicly after director Matthew Vaughn claimed that 20th Century Fox had prepared a fake X-Men The Last Stand script centered heavily on Storm in order to persuade her to sign on, with no intention of keeping that version once she agreed. Berry reshared the claim and wrote about the shady things that can happen behind an actor's back, while Vaughn said the alleged tactic was so disturbing that it helped convince him to leave the project. That is what makes Halle Berry's backstage story so haunting. She was not a powerless newcomer by then. She was already a proven star, already carrying a franchise, already one of the most recognizable women in film. And yet even she was still confronting chaos, disrespect, and alleged manipulation from the very people running the machine. How painful must it be to become powerful enough to lead and still find yourself forced to fight for basic honesty behind the scenes? That question is what lingers in Halle's story, because it reminds us that in Hollywood, prestige and mistreatment have often existed in the same room. Janet Jackson. By 2004, Janet Jackson was not just a star. She was royalty in American pop culture. Precise, polished, fearless, and completely in command of a stage. So when she stepped into the Super Bowl 38 halftime show, it should have been another reminder of her power. Instead, it became one of the most infamous live television moments in modern history. In the final seconds of her performance with Justin Timberlake, part of her costume was pulled away, briefly exposing her breast. The moment lasted almost no time at all, yet the reaction was immediate and explosive. The FCC moved against CBS. The incident drew congressional scrutiny, and live television standards tightened almost overnight. But while the phrase wardrobe malfunction entered the culture, so did something more damaging: the sense that Janet herself would carry the humiliation far longer than anyone else involved. What makes Janet's story so haunting is that the performance ended in seconds, but the punishment did not. Reports and retrospectives have described how CBS Chief Les Moonves was allegedly enraged, and how Janet's career absorbed the heaviest fallout while Timberlake's largely remained intact. Years later, even public discussion around the incident kept circling back to the racial and gendered imbalance and how blame was assigned. How devastating must it be to give decades of brilliance to an industry only to be reduced to one instant you did not carry alone? That is what gives Janet Jackson's story its lasting weight. It is not only about a live TV controversy, it is about how quickly a woman, especially a black woman, can be turned from icon to target when a powerful machine decides she should be the one left holding the shame. Zoe Saldana. Long before Zoe Saldana became the face of billion-dollar franchises and one of the most recognizable women in modern film, she was a young actress stepping into what should have felt like a dream. A role in Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl. For most rising stars, a film of that size would have felt like a doorway opening. For Zoe, it became something far more unsettling. Years later, she spoke candidly about how difficult that production was for her, describing it as an overwhelming and deeply unpleasant experience at a point when she was still new to the machinery of major Hollywood filmmaking. She said the scale of the production, the constant movement, the massive crew, and the chaotic environment all combined into something that left her feeling uncomfortable rather than inspired. Instead of feeling supported, she felt lost inside a system too big and too cold to notice what it was doing to a young actress trying to find her footing. What makes Zoe's story so haunting is the contradiction at its center. On screen, Pirates of the Caribbean looked magical, adventurous, and alive with swagger. Off-screen, one of its young performers was quietly questioning whether she even belonged in that world. In an earlier interview, she went further, saying the atmosphere felt elitist, and that the experience was so discouraging, it nearly pushed her out of the business entirely. How crushing must it be to land the opportunity of a lifetime and walk away feeling smaller instead of stronger? That is what gives this story its emotional weight. It was not the pain of public failure. It was the private wound of realizing that success and belonging are not the same thing. And perhaps the most revealing detail came years later when producer Jerry Bruckheimer apologized to her for what she had gone through. Zoe said that apology meant something because it showed he remembered and understood that the experience had left a mark. That does not erase the pain, but it explains why her story still resonates, sometimes the deepest. On-set scars are the ones hidden behind a box office triumph. Taraji P. Henson. By the time Taraji P. Henson stepped into the color purple, she was no beginner fighting for her first chance. She was an Oscar-nominated actress, a Golden Globe winner, and one of the most recognizable black women in American entertainment. That is exactly what makes her story so unsettling. Because even with all that history, all that proof, and all that talent, Taraji later described having to fight for the kind of basic respect many people assume a star of her level would never have to ask for. During the film's press tour, she spoke openly about how exhausting Hollywood had become for her, saying she was tired of working hard, breaking barriers, and still being treated as though none of it had changed her worth. But what gave her comments real force was not just the pain in her voice, it was the details. Taraji said she still had to audition for the role of Shug Avery, even though director Blitz Bazawule wanted her. She also described how the cast were initially given rental cars and expected to drive themselves to set in Atlanta, something she argued raised safety and liability concerns. According to Henson, there were also early issues around food dressing rooms and trailers, the kind of behind-the-scenes conditions that feel especially humiliating when you have spent decades proving your value. What makes Taraji's story hit so hard is that it exposes a different kind of Hollywood tragedy, not a sudden scandal, Not one explosive moment, but a slow, grinding erosion of dignity. She even said that on Empire, another major production, she had to fight for trailers that were not infested with bugs. That detail alone says so much. How many times can a woman prove her greatness before the industry stops treating her like she still has to beg? That is the wound at the center of Taraji's story. It is the pain of reaching the top and discovering that the climb did not buy comfort protection or even basic consideration. And that is what makes her backstage story so powerful. The heartbreak is not that Hollywood did not see her talent. It is that even after seeing it, it still expected her to settle for less. Viola Davis. Before Viola Davis became one of the most decorated actresses in American history, she spent years moving through an industry that often seemed to admire her power, while quietly rejecting everything about her that did not fit its narrow standards. That is what makes her backstage story so haunting. Viola has spoken openly about how Hollywood taught her for years to doubt whether she could ever be seen as desirable, elegant, or even fully worthy unless she reshaped herself. In a 2018 interview, she said she had stifled who she was in order to be seen as pretty, and that she had lost years trying to fit an image that was never designed with women like her in mind. Then in 2022, she went even further, saying that in Hollywood, you either have to be a black version of a white ideal, or you have to be white. That is not just criticism. It is a devastating description of an industry that can make a woman feel invisible even while handing her awards. And the pain did not disappear when success arrived. Viola later revealed that after being cast as Annalise Keating in How to Get Away with Murder, a friend told her that other black actors had said she was not pretty enough to play the role. Imagine that. By then, she already had the talent, the discipline, the credits, the force. But even then, beauty standards were still being used as a weapon. How crushing must it be to reach the top and still be told you do not look like someone who belongs there? That is the wound at the center of Viola's story. Perhaps the most heartbreaking detail is that one of her most acclaimed films, The Help, later became a source of regret. Viola said she felt the movie did not truly let the maids' voices be heard, even though she knew those women intimately through her own family history. That admission reveals everything about her backstage tragedy. Even when she was celebrated, she was still wrestling with whether the work had honored the truth of black women's lives. And that is why Viola Davis's story hits so hard. Her pain was not the pain of being ignored. It was the pain of being needed praised and still somehow asked to disappear inside someone else's version of herself. Jurnee Smollett. Long before Jurnee Smollett became the fierce, magnetic presence audiences would later admire in projects like Lovecraft Country, she was already growing up inside the machinery of Hollywood. She was not an outsider, arriving late and learning the rules as an adult. She was a child actor who learned them young. And that is exactly what makes her story so heartbreaking. In interviews about her career, Smollett said that sexual harassment on sets was not some rare, shocking exception in her life. It was something she had faced from the time she was around 12, from cast and crew members, while trying to do the job she loved in an industry that was supposed to protect someone that young. The Associated Press later highlighted her call for stronger protections and safer environments for child actors, underscoring that her story was not just about one bad moment, but about a pattern she carried for years. What gives Jurnee's story such emotional force is that it strips away one of Hollywood's favorite illusions, the idea that talent can shield you. In her telling, talent did not shield her. Experience did not shield her. Even longevity did not shield her. She explained that before Lovecraft Country, she could not confidently say she had worked on a set where she had not been sexually harassed or undermined. Think about the weight of that. Not one terrifying incident buried in the past, but the suggestion of a pattern stretching across an entire career. How devastating must it be to spend your childhood and adulthood in the same industry, only to keep learning that the room still does not feel safe? That is what makes her story linger. And that is why Jurnee Smollett's backstage story feels so tragic. It is not built around one headline-grabbing explosion. It is built around repetition, The slow realization that what should have been normal, respectful working conditions were treated as a privilege instead of a right. When she described Lovecraft Country as the first set where she did not feel sexually harassed or undermined, that was not only a compliment to that production, it was an indictment of everything that came before. And sometimes those are the stories that cut the deepest. Not the ones that happen once, but the ones that happen so often they begin to feel woven into the fabric of a career. Angela Bassett. Before Angela Bassett became one of the most respected actresses in American film, she gave the kind of performance that can change a career forever in What's Love Got to Do with It? On screen, she was fierce, magnetic, unforgettable. But what the audience saw as power was built out of something far more punishing behind the camera. In recent interviews reflecting on the film, Bassett said that shooting the violent scenes as Tina Turner was emotionally draining, physically demanding, and at times painfully real. She explained that some of those scenes took hours upon hours to complete, sometimes stretching into 16-hour days, forcing her to stay inside an atmosphere of fear, rage, and humiliation far longer than viewers could ever imagine from the finished film. She also said Lawrence Fishburne often acted as an advocate for her on set during those sequences, helping protect her and make sure she was all right while they recreated moments of domestic violence again and again. What makes Angela Bassett's story so haunting is that this was not simply difficult acting. It was the burden of having to embody terror over and over until the line between performance and exhaustion began to blur. One especially revealing detail came from her recollections of the physicality involved in those scenes she has described, how demanding they were on her body and spirit, and how careful she and Fishburne had to be while filming the abuse that shaped Tina Turner's life. How heavy must a role become when the most unforgettable scenes are also the ones you have to survive in order to create? That is the question that gives Angela's story its emotional force, and that is why her backstage story lingers. Angela Bassett did not just play pain, she had to revisit it, sustain it, and carry it through punishing shoot days until it became part of the fabric of the film itself. The result was extraordinary, but the path to it was anything but glamorous. That is what makes her story one of the most compelling tragedies behind the making of an iconic performance. Sometimes the brilliance audiences remember is born from a process far harsher than they ever see. Octavia Spencer. Before Octavia Spencer became an Academy Award winner, she spent years in Hollywood doing the kind of work the industry often praises in public and undervalues in private. She was talented, dependable, unforgettable on screen, but rarely treated like someone the system was eager to reward fairly. That is what makes her backstage story so compelling. Even after the help turned her into one of the most respected actresses in the business, Octavia later revealed that unequal treatment did not suddenly disappear. In one widely discussed example, she said she was initially offered far less than she deserved for a project, despite her experience and proven value. It took Jessica Chastain stepping in and leveraging her own power to help secure Octavia a much better deal, one that reportedly multiplied the original offer. That moment became bigger than a salary story. It exposed a painful truth about Hollywood. Even when a black actress has an Oscar acclaim and audience respect, the system can still act as if she should feel lucky just to be in the room. What makes Octavia's story hit so hard is that it is not about one cruel insult or one explosive confrontation. It is about a quieter kind of humiliation, the kind that happens when a person's excellence is obvious, yet the people controlling the budget still test how little they can pay her. That kind of disrespect cuts deep because it is so calculated. It tells you they know your worth, but are still hoping you will accept less. How heartbreaking must it be to win the highest honor in your field and still have to prove that your talent deserves proper value? That is the wound at the center of Octavia Spencer's story. And that is why her backstage story matters so much. It reminds viewers that exploitation in Hollywood does not always come wrapped in scandal. Sometimes it comes as a contract, a low offer, a dismissive number quietly placed on the table. Octavia Spencer's story lingers because it reveals how even success does not automatically protect a black woman from being undervalued behind the scenes. Sometimes the applause is loud, and the respect is still missing. Raven-Symoné. Long before Raven-Symoné became one of the most recognizable faces on American television, she was already learning one of the cruelest lessons show business can teach a child. Sometimes the people around you notice your body before they notice your talent. Raven entered the industry extraordinarily young, and by the time audiences fell in love with her energy, humor, and confidence, she had already been carrying pressure that no child should have to carry. In interviews, she later revealed that body shaming followed her from an early age. She recalled being around 7 years old on The Cosby Show and being told she could not eat certain foods at craft services because she was getting fat. Years later, she said those experiences contributed to so many mental issues, a heartbreaking phrase that makes clear how early the damage began. What makes Raven's story so painful is the contrast at its center. To the audience, she looked bright, funny, fearless, the kind of child star who seemed born for the spotlight. But behind the scenes, that same spotlight was already teaching her to be self-conscious, to monitor herself, to question whether she was acceptable as she was. She also spoke about being criticized later in her career for her size, while performing, including hearing comments that she was too big to carry a long concert. How heartbreaking is it when a child learns shame before she fully learns confidence? That question is what gives Raven's story its emotional force, because the wound was not caused by one dramatic incident. It was built slowly through repetition until it became part of how she saw herself. And that is why Raven-Symoné's backstage story lingers. In a later Vanity Fair interview, she reflected on child stardom with the clarity of someone who understands both its magic and its cost. She survived it, grew beyond it, and remained an icon. But behind the smile America remembers was a young girl being shaped by an industry too ready to judge and not nearly ready enough to protect. Janet Hubert. Long before the word recast became part of television gossip, Janet Hubert was helping build one of the most beloved black sitcoms in America. As the original Aunt Viv on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, she brought elegance, intelligence, warmth, and steel to the role. To viewers, she looked like the emotional center of the Banks family, composed, commanding, unforgettable. But behind the laughter and the ratings, the atmosphere around the show was becoming increasingly strained. Hubert left the series after its third season in 1993 and was replaced by Daphne Maxwell Reid. For years, the public was left with a simplified version of the story, creative differences. But later interviews and the 2020 reunion revealed something far more painful, a collision of ego, power, money pressure, and public humiliation that followed Hubert for decades. What makes Janet Hubert's story so haunting is that her loss was not limited to one role. During the reunion, she explained that she had been offered what she described as a really bad deal, one that would have reduced her salary and limited her ability to work elsewhere. At the time, she was also dealing with pregnancy and serious stress at home, which made the situation even more precarious. Instead of being understood, she felt she was being pushed out. Then came the part that cut even deeper the public narrative. Will Smith later admitted he had made a horrible error in how he judged her and underestimated her value to the show. And during the reunion, he acknowledged that he had made the set difficult for her. That matters because for years, Hubert's image was shaped by a version of events that left her looking bitter, difficult, and disposable. How devastating must it be to help create television history, only to watch the story move on, without you and against you? That is the ache at the center of Janet Hubert's backstage story. She did not just lose a part. She lost years to a narrative she could not control. And that is why her story still lingers, because sometimes the deepest wound in Hollywood is not being replaced, it is being remembered unfairly. After hearing these stories, one question becomes impossible to ignore. How many more painful truths are still hidden behind fame, applause, and red carpets? These women gave the world unforgettable performances, but many paid a price the public never fully saw. Were they simply survivors of a broken system, or proof that Hollywood has protected the powerful for far too long? That debate is far from over, and your voice matters. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And for more powerful, emotional, and untold celebrity stories, make sure you follow and subscribe to Black Legends Revealed, where the truth behind the spotlight is finally exposed.